I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Clissold-Vasey. His background is different to many people that we've had on the podcast, and I'm sure he'll explain more as we go through the show. But I think, again, that difference brings a different perspective to the way that he has delivered change and transformation. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Richard. Hi, Richard, and thanks for joining us today. I love the fact that we have people on this podcast from such a vast array of backgrounds. And I'm delighted that you have been able to join us today, because I don't believe that we've had anyone on previously that's got such a sort of sales and marketing type background and then market research background like you. So it'd be really interesting to hear more about your experiences as we progress. But first, do you just want to give us a brief overview of your experience to date so that we can put the future conversation into context?
Yes, definitely, Tony. Good afternoon. So I'm Richard Clissold-Vasey, but people call me Richard CB. And my career has covered sort of three chunks. The first chunk was working, as you said, in sales and marketing roles for businesses like Mars. I actually started in the motor industry for Rover cars. I went through the milk round, for those that remember that, when you assumed that you'd get a job. So I applied for car companies and beer companies and ended up in a car company. I then moved into consulting mid-stage, and I did that because I felt it was time to set up my own business, and I thought that time was running out. So I set up my own consultancy, and I then ended up joining a boutique consultancy after that. Again, working in sales and marketing, but this time advising some of the sort of biggest brands around the world about growth, but also about sort of organizational capability. I first really got involved in transformation after I joined the insight industry. So I joined TNS. TNS was bought by Kantar. And quite quickly, I moved from a sort of a specialist retail marketing role into organizational change, because I sort of lost the will to live, because the company was this huge business, networked across the world. Everybody did things in different ways. Some bits of it were brilliant, lots of it weren't. And there was a new chief strategy officer, and I just threw my name in the ring and said, I can help. And since then, that industry is an industry that's going through massive change. So I've been involved in restructures and changing the role of the organization, from sort of research to consultancy, analytics, bringing in multiple data flows. It's been a sort of whirlwind.
It's interesting. I think, as you know, I got involved in one of the group companies in the same group, and there's that background of being growing through lots and lots of mergers and acquisitions globally. Creates so many interesting cultures and so many interesting challenges when you come into look at that integration piece. But we maybe touch on that later, because I'm quite keen just to explore your thinking around that, because I believe that over the coming 12-18 months, as we come out of COVID, I think there'll be lots of merged acquisitions. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that and your experiences of being involved in an organisation that's done lots of M&A activity.
Definitely, and it's interesting. When I joined TNS originally, I thought, this is a huge business. I'm sort of fine now. We'll buy things, and then 10 minutes later, we were bought, and then subsequently lots of other, lots of stuff. I ended up supporting the acquisition of an analytics business quite recently, and it just never stopped.
Yeah. So we always start this podcast off with the same question. So how do you define transformation?
And this feels like an exam question, because it's been answered 42 times before or something. So I've got two lenses, I guess, which describe it for me. The first is, and I typically think business transformation. So I think transformation is something that impacts multiple functions in an organization. So they need to evolve together or to create something new. That the bigger sort of factor, I think, is the vision for the business that you are looking to deliver is significantly different from where the current business is. So we're not looking at some sort of evolution which is incremental. It is a shift of sort of dramatic proportions in terms of when you look at the end point versus the beginning point.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in terms of your background, then, what's the biggest transformation you've been involved in? Just, expanding what you've just said.
So as I said, I worked in Kantar for a number of years. When I joined the organisation, it was a research business that commissioned survey-based research. We basically have moved, the organisation moved to a position where it is and this is the insights division of Kantar. Kantar is a huge business. This is sort of the $2 billion chunk. A business which has shifted from research to consultancy, to knowing about sample sizes and sort of a functional expertise, to a very client-centric. We know about the challenges that clients have around marketing and innovation and customer experience. Alongside that has come a shift from sort of very manual processes to technology. First of all, technology driving, replacing manual processes and delivering efficiencies and speed, but then whole approaches to delivering work being put into systems. Right. And then sort of the two other changes. One is from sort of single data sources to multiple data sources and hardcore analytics. I mean, really clever, smart stuff. And then a shift from sort of tolerating clients to being very client focused. I mean, really obsessive. And that's a shift which has taken place in many different countries around the world. So I think I've worked face to face in 30 countries, but with another sort of 40. And of course, all of those businesses are different starting points.
Yeah. And I know from my experience with the group company, the clients could be local clients, but a lot of them are global clients that have got those multiple touch points, and getting some consistency in approach was always a challenge. Is that what were you experiencing that as well? And what did you do to start to embed that sort of consistent approach?
I mean, that's interesting. One of probably my first experience of true transformation from a central role was the recognition that the organisation actually was working as a networked global business rather than having one approach. I mean, one approach to PowerPoint, one approach to how we describe client organisations. So that big shift came through a consistent client engagement and delivery model. So this is how we talk to clients. This is how we think about their problems. This is how we work out what we need to do for them, and this is how the end deliverables are presented. And took that to 70 countries globally. And interestingly, it came with a new CEO. It came with a huge amount of impetus, so a bit of urgency. And we actually launched it to sort of the 13 countries that dominated the sales of the world in something like 14 weeks. And that's something like 36 launch events, 14 weeks, 3,500 people retrained on this new way of working, and then 2 years worth of pushing to really build it in. And that, interestingly, that shift was a very big starting point to, we're going to be consistent around a lot of other things. So you need a platform, don't you? You need something which sort of sets a tone that you can then build off.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting your approach that you've taken though around let's get some momentum going really quickly, get that sort of real clarity about what we're trying to do. Yeah. And then let's have a tail of embedding it. I think all too often organizations spend too long in that planning phase, and it's almost reverse. We have like a long tail up front to plan it, and so we know the nth degree of what we're going to do, and then we try to deliver it really, really quickly. And I find that sort of ability to build something or get the momentum and going, and then systematically look to improve and embed and adapt in an agile way ends up delivering a much higher level of returns far quicker than doing it the other way.
Yes, as long as, so I completely agree with you, as long as what you're delivering on the first iteration is good enough to get buy-in, good enough to deliver the impact.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, it's you don't just go flying off and shooting from the hip. Absolutely, but don't spend too much time trying to plan the nth to the nth degree is probably the message.
But I think you also find when you do that through that first iteration, you learn what different people in your organization then need. So you can work out your plan because people are telling you what they need, or you see where the leaders are lacking the skill set, or you realize there's a hole and you missed something, or you realize that you're going to need to bring this to life through very real examples. So you start working with a particular client or organization to case study it. So you learn through that process, don't you, I think?
Yeah, and it starts, as you say, having that clear vision of what you want the end point to be.
Yeah.
You're less concerned about how you're going to get from A to B, but as long as you've got the clarity about what you want B to look like or to feel like, then you can engage people and get them involved in helping you to get from A to B, can you?
Yes, and this is what I think we completely agree in that. So you described this is what it's going to look like, this is what it's going to feel like. It's not, there are 4 strategic drivers on a PowerPoint slide. It's, as someone in the team, whatever your job is, you've got to be able to get what it's going to be like for you in the future and what the benefits are and how it's going to work. And I feel like that's sometimes you don't know enough to really create as much as that as you really need. Or other times businesses just don't push that hard. And then you end up with a fluffy vision, which people don't really buy.
Yeah, I agree. So you talk a lot about people-driven change. In fact, I think that's your website address. So tell me more about what you mean.
Yes, certainly. And it's my website address. I'm not actually selling anything. It's something that I've been banging on about because I sort of truly believe it. And I having listened to a number of these podcasts, and we've spoken a number of times. And I guess probably the world that we've grown up in, I've seen hierarchical management try and push change to organizations. And we've all seen very smart people get into a room and design something which they think is amazing and push it through an organization. And it just doesn't work. So my belief is that if you involve people, if they participate in design, the testing, the piloting, and the implementation of what you're doing, you build better solutions. You get to better answers, and people are more likely to get behind better answers. And if simultaneously you work to engage and communicate with the broader population, and this isn't just an email update, this is actually get them really thinking about that future that you're describing and keep them abreast of the changes and bring them into the problems that you're focusing on. And you build advocacy, you build ownership of the change, you build a momentum about what's going to happen in the future. And therefore, rather than pushing something through the business sort of picks it up and starts to run with it. And you can feel an energy change. And it's something I've experienced launching different things, from a finance tool to a whole new operating model. There's an energy around what you're trying to achieve. And that's how I describe people-driven change.
Yeah, I think it's far easier helping people to pull something into a business, isn't it, than trying to push it in. And if you can get that dynamic where people are pulling it in because they want it and they believe in it, it's a damn sight easier.
And I don't know about you, but I have experienced that moment when you're standing in front of a smart crowd and you're explaining where we're going and what we're going to do, and someone asks you that question because they don't believe you or they're doubting how you're going to do it. And they're probably right because they know more than you because they're closer to how stuff works. So the other thing about this approach is observation of how people work is so key because it's not the same as a job spec. It's not the same as what the board director thinks or even the line manager thinks. So I think I've had too many in my sort of former years critical moments where someone has sort of pushed back on something I've been trying to achieve and they've just been right. So to avoid that, there's a sort of self-correcting mechanism of getting people to participate as you go along, but without overwhelming the organisation. It can't be done in a way which is, administrative and, workshops every day.
Yeah, but it's interesting actually. You just reminded me of a workshop that we ran that I was involved in a good few years ago. But that exactly what you just described happened, and we're talking about what the future is going to look like, what we're going to do, and this this lady in the back sort of put her hand up and said, "Can I ask you a question?" And she was absolutely superb at really sort of honing in on an issue that we didn't know the answer to. We had an inkling, but we didn't know the full answer to. And it was the one question that you were like, "Don't ask me that question."
Love it.
But we were fortunate and got a bit of a get out of jail card, in so much because we'd taken people on that journey, and it was much more sort of a collegiate type of approach rather than us doing it to them or us driving it in. Other people within the room, not part of the sort of program leadership team, but other stakeholders started answering the question. So we just let the conversation flow, and off the back of that conversation, we got much clearer about what we were trying to do and what we needed to do than we had before we went into the workshop.
But that's absolutely the key, isn't it? Is you're not pushing it on people, you're going on a journey with them. So you didn't go, "No, you're wrong." I've experienced something similar where, with a fantastic colleague of mine, we created a new operating model for an organisation. It was really smart. We were really pleased. We were putting it in front of the members of the leadership teams who hadn't been involved in its development so far. And we were pitching it as we'd like your input into something. But really, we did want them to say yes. And someone just stood up and said, "I just don't get it. And if you're going to present it like that, we should just give up because it's too complicated." And it was one of those critical moments where you can either argue or you can listen. And, after the punch on the face had sort of ricocheted off, it's like, yeah, you know what, you're probably right. But are you arguing about what we've created? No. So you're arguing around how we presented it. Fantastic. We can work on that.
Yeah.
So it's how you, in the way that you described it, it's how you involve people so that they feel they can tell you that. Because if that woman hadn't asked that question of you, you'd still have a gaping hole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you want people to open up to you. You want people to challenge you, and I think that's it's a lesson I learned very early on, that in any briefing or in any communication, start it off saying, this is open to debate. We want you to ask questions. We want you to challenge back, because we don't have all the answers, and that is almost gives you that get out of jail card. Because you say, we don't have all the answers. We want your involvement.
And I think that evolves through a process. So there's a point when you have nailed stuff down. So you shift the conversation to how do we communicate this or how do we implement this? But when you're happy that you have got the right input from people. But I think what's also key is that you have the right people in the room. So quite often you can't have that conversation well enough unless you've got the guy from IT or ops or the woman from strategic sales or whatever it is together. Because people can't see even the questions when they're just sitting in their silos, but also having people from, in different stages of their career and different levels in the organization. Because very often it's the person who's either doing the work behind the scenes or talking to the client who experiences something that you just don't know about.
Great. What skills and experience do you think have helped you in the sort of change and transformation world that you picked up in that early stage of your career?
I've been incredibly lucky because, as you say, I went into sales first, and it was interesting. I only just went into sales. I was looking at marketing. Marketing seemed far more sexy. I was working for a motor organisation. The sales director came up to me as I was reaching the end of my graduate training. He said, "Richard, are you going to come and join the real men in sales, or are you going to go into flower arranging in marketing?" And this was a very male-dominated culture 30 odd years ago, and I was quite simply too scared to say no. So I joined sales. But I can honestly say that, and I've gone on to train sales and negotiations, strategic selling and account management and stuff. That client focus, that selling focus, the understanding and trying to resolve someone's problems, that's been absolutely key, internally and externally, definitely. So I got involved very early on in something called category management, which is when retailers and suppliers started working together to resolve how you sell stuff better through stores. And it's not more of my brand, it's more of the category.
Yeah.
And that was where insights started to be used, not just to sell, but to understand and to position stuff for the shopper. So, the ultimate customer. So I got involved in the use of insight to solve business problems very early on. So that's again been incredibly helpful.
Yeah, interesting. I think, like you say, that approach to putting yourself in the shoes of the customer, or in our world now, putting yourself in the shoes of the organisation, the people within the organisation that's being asked to change, it gives you that different perspective, doesn't it?
Yes.
You can have a view on the world as the leader that's driving in the change, but if you change that perspective to say, how would I feel if I was the recipient of this change? It just puts that completely different perspective on things.
And just how they're feeling about it. I mean, I was involved in working with the big telecoms organisations when the iPhone arrived, and some of the big brands at the time. We were, as an organisation, we were asked to look at whether the iPhone would be successful, because they were very, very sceptical. And just being able to put yourself into their shoes to understand that they couldn't see it being successful because it wasn't in their interest.
Yeah.
And then how you reframe the conversation, or the facts that you use, or just to shift the mindsets. And those where the mindset didn't shift, they're not players anymore. The world is harsh, isn't it? But I think on an organizational level, if you can't get your head around how the junior person who does this task 30 times a day is going to feel when you replace it with technology, you've got problems.
Absolutely. So just coming back to your M&A experience as well, what are the key learnings that you can take from the activities that you've undertaken in that mergers and acquisition world?
So I think there's a set of learnings from having it done to you, and a set of learnings from doing it. And I think the learnings from having it done to you are when you engage people in that process, even if the end point isn't necessarily good for everybody, it's better. So honesty around what the future aim for the organisation is, and how the process is going to work, and what's likely to change. And obviously you can't share everything, because some of this stuff involves people and teams that are going to go whatever. But I've been in a situation where it's just been completely in the dark, and the organisation has just switched off. People just aren't engaged because they know it's going to be bad, or they think it's going to be bad. And then I've been involved in acquisitions where just tried to change that mindset to, here's where we're trying to go, here's where we see the fit, here's where there's some real strength, here's some stuff we just don't understand. Oh yeah, and by the way, there's some overlap in terms of services. We're going to have to deal with that pretty quickly. And I think that works incredibly well. But the building relationships with the organisations that you're bringing in as early as possible is incredibly key, I feel.
Yeah, and you touched on again. I suppose that the same sort of messaging really is what we've been talking about already. It's looking at the impact that it's going to have on the individual, and realising that their first thoughts will be, what does it mean to me?
Yeah.
So it's what's in it for me, or what does it mean to me? And naturally you start to think, especially if you are being acquired, if you're a part of the organisation that's being acquired, that your job's at risk. So it's what does it mean to me? And you've got to overcome those questions. And sometimes you have the answers, and often you don't. But you can't just ignore it. You've got to confront it.
But that's the same, isn't it? For every change or transformation initiative that we run, ultimately it comes down to an individual where something is going to be different or not.
Yeah.
And if it is going to be different, they're going to then have to embrace that change and go through some form of personal transition to do things differently, which is tough and exposes you. But I think the other thing about acquisitions, I worked on a merger of two big organizations relatively recently. They'd been competing for years. They were then moved into the same group. And we realized that we needed to actually sort of, just get over and pull the two businesses together. And through the process, whilst the organizations were doing very similar things, there was just different language. And some things that looked like they were being done in the same way, when you looked underneath the covers, they were being done very differently. And I think one of the skill sets that we need in transformation is you've got to be able to get under the bonnet. You've got to be able to really uncover. Yeah, and so, for example, one of the language changes was, the word deliver. was being used differently within the two organisations. And I actually set up a conversation at a board meeting between two board directors, and I asked one to talk about delivery and the other to talk about delivery. Then I stopped them. I said, just explain what you mean. And in that moment, it's like one of those table of gloves moments. There's you probably know what I mean. Everybody realised around the room that this was a big shift that we were driving. It wasn't just new process; it was how people thought.
It'd be interesting just to get your perspective on when there was such a difference in just the language. How did you go about bringing those two organisations together into a consistent language?
So I think there was three big shifts. The first big shift was really close working with the boards, because these were people who were very close to their businesses, and it would have been easy to try and sort of mechanically fix stuff as you describe, but actually we needed to get to the leaders, really closely, get them on board, get them on side, get them talking to each other, and they needed to be at the hub of everything. The second thing was there were certain things that just needed to change for everybody. So rather than saying we're going to do it their way or your way, we said, okay, we're going to evolve this into something different. Yeah. And even though that something different was built up of the component parts of both, and it was launched very definitely as something new. And then the third thing was around culture and culture. I think that was such a big shift. So we actually did a cultural assessment of the two organisations, and that really showed how things like hierarchy were just seen as so different in the organisations. You could, from the work that we did, you could sense the flashpoints that were going to come. So we focused very heavily on culture. We, we're very clear about the behaviours that were going to take us through to a new place, and make those behaviours hard things, not just a fluffy poster that goes on the wall, but these are the 2 or 3 things that are going to make a difference as we work through this. And then we built culture and behavioural change very clearly into the the transformation of these two businesses, because it was an outcome that we needed, but also it was one of the things that motivated people to this new place.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That cultural issue comes up time and time again, and even though organisations may have operated in the same industry, worked in very, very similar ways in very similar geographies, when you go into each organisation, the culture is often very, very different. I remember one of the earlier podcasts with Ellie Holt, who did a merger of 2 big social housing organisations. She brought out that very point. 2 housing organisations operating in the similar parts of London, grown at similar sort of rates, probably initially thought that the cultures would have been similar, but when they went into them, they're quite different. And creating a new culture for the new organisation was the bedrock on which they drove the merger together.
Definitely. And interestingly, in this case, there were the 2 separate businesses were based in London, but then there was one of the businesses had a sort of an office based out of London, which was where the business originally evolved from. Mm-hmm. People had been there for many years, and they were part of this phenomenal industry business and were phenomenally proud. And they would always say, "Oh, we do things differently here." And I knew that we got it right on launch day when I travelled to that office specifically. I mean, we made sure we launched across the 3 offices equally. And I arrived at that office on the morning of the launch, and it had turned to the new branding colours, and people were fully on side. And I literally, as I walked through the door, I thought it's going to be fine. And because all the pre-work had meant that people in that office knew where they were going, brought into it. We even actually we let them have a goodbye party. So we let them have a goodbye party to the old business, all unofficial. So they, felt that they were doing it on the side, but actually, we funded it, and that allowed people to sort of leave the old behind and sort of welcome the new.
So one of the challenges in any change program or any transformation or any merger is realizing the benefits.
I think you can look at this from 2 different levels. So one level, I think, is around just the individual. So when we go through change, an individual has to do something differently in order that whatever they do differently works with other people to deliver the impact that we want.
Yeah.
But I think we very often forget that personal transition is so key, because it's, and to work running a bike. It's hard, it's brave, but people are doing that, in front of their colleagues with new technology or new skills in front of a client or new whatever it is. So I think helping people through their personal transitions is absolutely key to delivering the financial numbers that sit on the P&L. The other thing that I've always found key is moving from the design work within your transformation into testing, into piloting, and then implementation with full participation of teams. Mm-hmm. So, and by the time you get to piloting, actually giving the ownership of monitoring the impact, and actually the ownership of monitoring the progress at implementing the new ways of working to the piloting teams. So whilst you might have central resource overseeing or supporting, you actually give clear about accountability to the people who are delivering within their bit of the business what is then going to be rolled out elsewhere. Yeah. And you mimic that as you go to the full-on implementation. So again, the accountability, you push it as locally as possible, and you push measurement of progress and impact as locally as possible. And then, of course, you monitor it. You be all over, is it working? And you jump on it when it's not happening. But it's about accountability. And of course, you can only do that if you've designed stuff in the right way and you've designed the implementation in the right way. But that's why you bring people in as you're doing both those things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And again, it reminds me of I can't remember who it was who used the analogy because it's a good few years ago. But they always talked about people being like a spring. So if you're not driving that accountability down to a local level and really supporting them and helping them, naturally, as you push it, if you're not there to support them and make sure that if they're struggling, you're there to ensure that they go down the right path, the spring will automatically come back to where it was before and start to go back to how they used to work previously. And if you haven't got that localized accountability and that localized management, it's very, very difficult for anybody to lead across a large organization that the amount of change required to deliver the end result.
That's a great point. I think also just your reference to leaders is really key. I mean, one of the things I found, one of the features of most big transformations is that the people who are leading your teams aren't comfortable where you're going because they just can't be. They've been doing something else for 10 years. So how you help leaders see what that future is, understand it, but also recognize where they need help. And that might need help they might never need to do the thing that's coming, but they need to be able to talk about it or describe it or support others. So I think actively, getting real commitment around from leaders to where you're going is key, because very often we think we've got it, but actually you haven't got it. And there's this continual barrier because you end up you end up thinking that you've got sort of connection in the business, but actually there's a couple of key people who say, let's just carry on the way you were, really. Yeah, it's a nice thing, but just do what you did on the last Thursday. And you only move them forward when they participate in the change, but actually when you help them go through the shifts. And sometimes the coaching by those leaders is quite raw because actually they are very exposed.
Agreed. And the one thing that is easy to ignore is to ensure that their KPIs are changed as well. Because I've been involved in a number of programs in the past that have gone wrong, and I've got brought in to sort of look to recover them. And the change leadership team did everything right. They did all the communication, put all the support in, but you're asking someone to do this when they were being measured by this, and they'd not changed they'd not changed the performance measurement for the individual to align it to the new ways of working. So the managers were being sort of pulled from pillar to post. Right. And they didn't know what they didn't know. You get the excuse. Oh yeah, but we set the objectives for the year, so we can't change it. Yeah, but we're changing the business. or you find that the KPIs are changed within the little bit of the business where most of the change is happening, but not in operations or not in finance. So you've then got these, crunchy points where the different functions can't work together well. Yeah. Right? It's like any change, and you've got to look at the end-to-end change, because there'll be ripple effects all the way through the business. You need to understand those ripples.
Gotcha. And that's why you need to bring in that finance person, even if they're not involved in the new client-centric shift that you're driving, because something that they are doing is going to be monitoring these people or measuring it, whatever. So it's key to be looking at all angles.
So some of the programs you've been involved in have been quite big programs, multi-year programs. How have you gone about maintaining the momentum? You were saying earlier you started off getting that real momentum and then driving on the engagement, but on a multi-year program, how do you go about driving that momentum and maintaining that momentum?
That's a hard question, isn't it? Because more often than not, that momentum doesn't happen because the next big thing comes along. It's interesting. The client engagement model that I launched must be 10 years ago now. Was up until about a year ago still in place, but it had been through a number of rebrandings.
Right.
And I think to maintain momentum, you've got to be clear how long you're going to put the real pressure on. So this launch of this particular thing, we had 2 years where we were on it, sort of creatively managing its central team. But then it needed to be owned by the business. But there still need to be some form of connection, some form of building the thing that we're doing into the strategic priorities. I think that the moment the strategic priority that you're working on suddenly becomes less strategic or just accepted, you start to lose that. I don't have a magic answer other than you've got to keep it front of mind. You've got to keep it important for the leadership. You've got to keep tracking the impact of whatever you're doing. But ultimately, you can't, as new initiatives come along, as the organisation goes through a different change, you can't cover everything. I mean, where I've seen this done most successfully is where the narrative around the change that you're driving retains a central core, and then it evolves over time. But you take what you need to forward, you allow some things to drop because actually you have moved on. But the narrative that you run with leaders and teams across the organisation allows you to keep on top of the things that have got to be driven. And again, it comes down to leadership. If it drops off the leaders list, it drops off everybody's list. Yeah,
agreed. And I think the one organisation that did it really well that I can remember is they were very clear about the vision and the long-term vision and what it meant to everybody. But then they put a roadmap in place almost that was that outlined a series of programs, initiatives, and they then managed each of those, not independently, because there's the overriding sort of program control and management of it. But from a communications perspective and from a engagement perspective, it was a series of activities that you could get your initial sort of drive, momentum, and then embed, and then you get another one in embed, and then you get another one. It was all outlined in an overriding sort of roadmap, and that I've tried to use that a few times, and it's an approach that seems to go down reasonably well because it just breaks that sort of 3-4 year program down into 9-12 months.
I like that a lot, and when you talk about enduring, I'm thinking 2, 3, 4 years is where we've got to get to. I think one of the things is being honest, isn't it? So I worked on a transformation where from day one, the conversation that I was having with the CEO was, there's a lot of people out there who are just waiting till you move to your next job because they know you're only going to be in this for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, and they're literally and people will tell you that. They'll tell you, we've just got to do enough to get through the next few years because then management will change. So if you plan for that, if you go, no, we're going to push really hard to move you now, but also we're going to recognise that when leadership changes, we've glued down enough and are committed to enough that it's going to carry on rolling. And I actually had an MD of it's actually a large German business turn around to me and said, yeah, you got us in the end, but for 2 years we did try and just ignore you, but in the end you got us and we moved the whole business.
Yeah, I remember one organisation about 15 years ago I was working with, and one of the mid managers came in and said, well, if we keep our head down long enough, you'll go away and the next initiative will come along. And that's what we've been doing for the last 15 years. So why are you any different? And that was the challenge almost on day one.
Yeah, and if you've got that as a starting point, you know where the bar is.
Absolutely. So to finish off then, we always have one final question. What's the one thing you feel is an essential for successful delivery of any transformation?
So we've talked about having a great vision. We've talked about personal transition. We've talked about roadmaps. I think it's to do with roadmaps. I think the one thing that really matters is that people can see not just where you're going, but the steps that are going to take the organization there. I.e., we're going to build one of these, we're going to integrate this, and then the steps for them. And that means for you, you're going to have to learn some of these skills, you're going to have to drop these skills, and then the change starts to become real because they can see forward, they can see expectations, and they can start to believe that those stepping stones are actually going to take you to the transformation. So irrespective of project plans or great ideas or big strategic shifts, simple clarity on the steps that the organization is going to go through and the steps that the individual goes through to get to that future place, I believe is so key. And of course, they then drive some of the activities that you do.
No, perfect way of ending and brings it right back to that people-driven change agenda.
I was trying not to use the words. I'm very glad you have. Excellent.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard.
Brilliant, Tony. Thank you very much.
Once again, Richard, thank you very much. A great way to spend 40 minutes in your company discussing your experience around change and transformation. Richard is an active member of the Transformation Leaders Hub, a place where people operating in project, program, change and transformation can come together and develop relationships and create collaborations and just get to know each other and build your peer group. So if you haven't already checked it out, check it out today. See the link in the show notes. With that, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks' time on the next show.